I know you have very complex and sophisticated views.
Very kind.
But give us a sense, just to bring back to this question of the war. Do you feel that it has been an embarrassing story for the kind of anti-war left, and that it's a hard one for them to talk about? Or what's your response to that?
I mean, embarrassing is a strong word, but I think you're right to say that it's very few people expected it. I mean, you can talk about Peter Hitchens, right? You can talk about right-wing iconoclasts just as quote-unquote embarrassed. And I think, I don't think you could call them embarrassed, because I think the thinking they mobilized was entirely reasonable. They were calling on 20, 25 years of data. They were calling on reams of personal anecdotal experience and so on. What was overlooked, I think, by both right and left was the role of ultra-nationalist Russian ideology. You know, people like Alexander Dugin, his role and his proximity to the Kremlin is overstated, but he does speak to a certain part of Russian politics. You know, the recently deceased Liberal Democrat leader in Russia, for instance, Liberal Democrat leader, it's quite funny that that party has that name. You know, it's almost like he tried to constantly outdo himself with ever more outrageous statements every year. So this idea that Putin is somehow an outlier, and that, you know, Russian politics and Russian civil society will return to some sort of more moderate mean in the absence of him, I think is very misplaced. Now, in a strange way, the left and right didn't quite get that. And I think we underplayed the importance of Russian ultranationalism. And we sort of adhered to the John Mearsheimer thing of it's not in their rational self-interest, and that dovetailed with our critique of NATO and so on. In terms of where we go forward...
Let me just ask you on that, because Jeremy Corbyn has just come out. He says we should be dismantling NATO. Yeah. That's wrong, is it? Or?
I think, that was taken a bit out of context. So he did say, ideally, typical Jeremy Corbyn, he said, ideally we have no military defences. Which again, I think a lot of people say, okay, fine, but that's not ever going to happen, right? So I thought he was kind of being a bit contrarian, but I also don't think he's saying, right, next Labour manifesto, let's get rid of NATO, because that wasn't being pushed on the ballot in 2019 or 2017. I think he's clearly still a NATO skeptic, and I think actually skepticism of NATO is again justified by the evidence. You know, if you look at the legacy of NATO intervention in Libya and Afghanistan, clearly mistakes were made. And I think if people aren't going to acknowledge that, we're going to have more problems as a civilization in the West going forward. So I wouldn't agree that he's pushing for the end of NATO and that Labour are going to sort of campaign for that anytime soon, because they're not.
So the question on the ballot paper, has Putin killed off populism? Do you feel that the populist left is dented by this? Do you think that the movement that you've been part of will be harder to win votes for because of what we're seeing going on in Europe?
No, I think it changes the contours. And it does. It's short term, of course it changes the contours. But politics, we all know this. Politics is 5, 10, 20, 30 years. Marxists aren't saying we want to persuade somebody next month. They're thinking in decades, as does the post-liberal right. And I think in terms of thinking in decades, not especially, no. In the short term, you're absolutely right. The heartbeat of you know the 21st century radical left has been anti-war activism. And so this is kind of like a silver bullet, a stake through the heart of that, absolutely. And you've got people in Finland, you know, a centre-left government. You've got the left party in Sweden, the Vänsterpartiet. They are terrified of saying that they're anti-war. So clearly, in that respect, it's changed. That may just mean, and I think this is not necessarily a bad thing, that the left moves towards, you know, workplace organising and labour rights. And I finish with this. Look at the United States right now. You've got trade union struggles in Amazon, Apple, Starbucks. These are iconic American brands now seeing workers asking for higher wages. So if that's the future of left organising rather than anti-war activism, which I think has its place, then I don't see that as a net loss for the left, no. I think that will actually, in a strange way, I think that will take it closer to blue-collar workers.
So we're putting anti-war on the back burner for potentially...
Don't be ashamed of it, but we're clearly we're in a different phase now. We're not in this unipolar post-9/11 moment anymore. And I think some people on the left haven't necessarily understood that, but I think those that do recognise that anti-war activism plays a very different role.